When the photographer called for just family during my brother-in-law's wedding reception, my mother-in-law Florence placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Not you, dear," she whispered with a saccharine smile. "These are for the actual Blackwood family album." My husband Curtis simply avoided my gaze as he joined his mother, brother, and new sister-in-law in front of the ornate floral arch that I had secretly paid for, along with the rest of this lavish spectacle. I stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, the champagne flute nearly shattering in my grip as I watched my family, pose without me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The string quartet I'd commissioned played softly in the background, the melody a stark counterpoint to the humiliation burning through my veins. 3 years of marriage, and still, Florence Blackwood had made it abundantly clear I would always be an outsider, a commoner who had somehow ensnared her precious firstborn son. The photographer adjusted his stance, directing the perfect family portrait. "Maybe move in closer, everyone. This is going in the foyer after all," Florence had exclaimed earlier. The foyer of the Blackwood estate, a place my money had helped maintain, though none of them knew the extent of it. Not even Curtis. As the camera flashed, capturing the beaming faces of the Blackwood dynasty, I made my decision. The champagne suddenly tasted sweeter as I realized that patience had its limits, and mine had just run out. Florence had no idea that by excluding me from this moment, she had set in motion the collapse of her carefully constructed facade. I took another sip, a small smile playing at my lips. By the end of this night, everyone would know exactly who had paid for the Blackwood family perfection. The grand Blackwood estate sprawled across 10 acres of meticulously landscaped gardens, its Georgian architecture a testament to old New England money and centuries of accumulated privilege. Today, it hosted the wedding of Toby Blackwood, Curtis's younger brother, to Natasha Reynolds, the daughter of a pharmaceutical executive whose family connections had earned Florence's enthusiastic approval. I watched as Florence fussed over Natasha's train, adjusting it with the proprietary care she had never once shown toward me. At 48, Florence Blackwood maintained the slim figure and flawless appearance of someone who had never known real hardship. Her silver-streaked chestnut hair was pulled into an elegant chignon, her emerald dress custom-made to complement the wedding's color scheme. Her voice carried across the garden as she directed servers, adjusted flower arrangements, and occasionally shot disapproving glances in my direction. "Kara," she had said when introducing me to distant relatives earlier, "Curtis's wife. She works in, what was it again, dear? Accounting." The dismissive wave of her hand erased my role as chief financial officer at Meridian Ventures, one of the most successful investment firms in Boston. In Florence's world, my career would never be as important as my failure to come from the right bloodline. Curtis materialized at my side after the photos concluded, his handsome face slightly flushed from champagne and familial pride. At 34, he had inherited his father's height and his mother's sharp features, a combination that still made my heart skip, despite the growing chasm between us. "Having a good time?" he asked, loosening his tie slightly. His wedding band caught the light, a simple platinum circle that had replaced the family signet ring he'd originally proposed with after Florence's intervention. "Wonderful," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. "Your mother has outdone herself with the arrangements," Curtis beamed, oblivious to the irony. "She's been planning this day since Toby was born, practically. Everything has to be perfect for the Blackwood-Reynolds union." I bit back the truth that threatened to spill from my lips. Perfect, yes, and made possible by the $3 million I had quietly transferred to the Blackwood family accounts over the past year. Money that had saved them from financial ruin after Edgar Blackwood's disastrous investment in a failed tech startup had nearly bankrupted the family, a secret Florence had begged me to keep from her sons. Your father would be proud, I said. Instead, watching Curtis's expression soften at the mention of Edgar, who had passed away 2 years ago from a sudden heart attack, leaving behind a financial mess that only I had been equipped to discover and address. He would, Curtis agreed, his gaze drifting to where his mother now stood with Allison Parker, her best friend and fellow board member of the Blackwood Foundation. Mom's kept his legacy alive beautifully. If only he knew. If only any of them knew that Edgar Blackwood's legacy had been a house of cards that I had quietly shored up while Florence maintained the illusion of unbroken prosperity. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had preserved the very family name that Florence deemed I wasn't good enough to fully claim. The string quartet transitioned to a waltz, and couples began filling the dance floor. Curtis excused himself to speak with a college friend, leaving me alone once more at the periphery of the celebration. I watched as Florence held court among Boston's elite, her laughter tinkling like the crystal champagne flutes. She caught my eye briefly, her smile never faltering as she gave me a small nod, acknowledgement without acceptance. As the evening progressed, I found myself on the terrace overlooking the gardens where the ceremony had taken place hours earlier. The roses were Florence's pride, their heady scent filling the air as dusk settled over the estate. Behind me, the reception continued in full swing, a perfect display of wealth and taste. Not enjoying the party? I turned to find Henry Lambert, Edgar's former business partner, and one of the few people who knew the truth about the Blackwood finances. At 65, Henry had the weathered look of someone who had earned his fortune rather than inherited it, his blue eyes sharp with intelligence and a hint of mischief. "Just getting some air," I replied, offering him a genuine smile. Unlike most in the Blackwood circle, Henry had always treated me as an equal, recognizing my financial acumen from our first meeting. "I saw what happened with the photos," he said, joining me at the balustrade. "Florence hasn't changed much over the decades, has she?" I laughed softly. "That would require self-awareness." Henry studied me for a moment. "You know, Edgar always said you were the best thing that ever happened to this family, though I suspect he wasn't just talking about making his son happy." "Edgar was a good man caught in a bad situation," I said carefully. "A bad situation you helped fix," Henry replied, his voice lowered despite the privacy of our location. Without taking credit, I sipped my champagne. Some things are better kept private. Until they're not. Henry's gaze was knowing as he gestured toward the reception. "Florence has been telling everyone the wedding was funded by the Blackwood Family Trust. Maintaining standards," she called it. The truth was far less glamorous. There was no trust left. Not after Edgar's failed investments and years of living beyond their means. The Blackwood name remained prestigious, but their accounts had been nearly empty when I quietly began transferring my own funds, money from my family's shipping business that I'd grown through savvy investments, to preserve the illusion of wealth that meant everything to Florence. "Standards are important to her," I replied neutrally. The French doors opened, spilling golden light onto the terrace as Florence emerged with Allison and several members of the Boston Symphony Board. Their laughter faltered upon seeing me with Henry. "Henry, darling," Florence called out, recovering quickly. "You simply must join us for the cake cutting. Kara, would you mind checking on the gift table? I think some cards may have fallen." The dismissal was thinly veiled, her smile not reaching her eyes. Henry squeezed my arm briefly before dutifully following Florence inside. I remained on the terrace, watching as Curtis joined them, laughing at something Allison's husband said. He hadn't looked for me once. It hadn't always been this way. When we first met at a charity gala 4 years ago, Curtis had been charming, attentive, and seemingly independent. The son of Edgar and Florence Blackwood who'd forged his own path in environmental law rather than joining the family's investment firm. Or so I'd thought. What I discovered after our wedding was a man still tethered to his mother's approval, a dependence that had only grown after Edgar's death. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The man who had once defended me against Florence's subtle criticisms now stood silently as his mother relegated me to the position of convenient outsider, useful for what I could provide, but never truly welcome. I made my way to the gift table, as instructed, not out of obedience but to avoid creating a scene. The enormous tent glowed with carefully curated lighting, highlighting floral arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Every detail screamed extravagance, from the hand-calligraphed place cards to the vintage champagne, all approved by Florence and paid for with money she didn't have. Natasha's parents, the Reynolds, circulated among guests with the confidence of people accustomed to wealth and influence. They had contributed to the wedding, of course, but nowhere near the amount Florence had led them to believe the Blackwoods were spending. The equal partnership between the families that Florence boasted about was built on financial fiction. "There you are!" Curtis appeared beside me, his cheeks flushed from dancing. "Mom's looking for you." "Is she?" I arched an eyebrow. I thought she preferred me out of sight. Curtis frowned, the crease between his brows deepening. "Don't start, Kara. Not today of all days." "Start what? A conversation about why your mother excluded me from family photos? Or why you let her?" He lowered his voice, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "You know how traditional Mom is. Toby is her baby, and she wanted the core family for some of the photos." "Core family," I repeated, the words bitter on my tongue. "And after 3 years of marriage, I'm still not family." Curtis sighed, the sound weary and familiar. "Can we not do this now? It's Toby's wedding. Mom worked so hard to make everything perfect." I stared at him, wondering when exactly he had become this person, this man who could watch his wife be humiliated and find excuses for it. When had his backbone dissolved so completely? "Yes," I said finally. "She certainly puts on an impressive show." Relief crossed his features, mistaking my statement for concession. "Thank you for understanding. She wants us for the toast in 5 minutes." He kissed my cheek quickly before disappearing back into the crowd. I remained by the gift table, fingers tracing the edge of an envelope addressed to the happy couple in Florence's distinctive handwriting. Inside would be a check for an amount that would impress the Reynolds. Money that, like everything else in this wedding, had ultimately come from me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had enabled all of this, the pretense, the exclusion, my own humiliation. For 3 years, I had maintained the charade of Blackwood prosperity out of love for Curtis and respect for Edgar's memory. I had been the silent foundation upon which Florence rebuilt her social empire after Edgar's financial mistakes nearly destroyed it. And my reward? To be treated as an accessory, convenient when needed and invisible when not. As I watched Florence gather the family, her definition of family, for the toast, something shifted inside me. The accumulated slights, the dismissals, the way Curtis consistently chose his mother's approval over his wife's dignity. It crystallized into a cold clarity I had never allowed myself before. Henry caught my eye from across the room, raising his glass slightly in acknowledgement. The small gesture of solidarity reminded me that I wasn't as powerless as Florence believed. I knew things the Blackwoods desperately needed to keep hidden. I controlled resources they desperately needed to maintain their facade. Florence clinked her knife against her crystal flute, silencing the room. "If I could have everyone's attention for a family toast to the newlyweds," she announced, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had hosted countless social events. Family. The word echoed in my mind as I watched Curtis, Toby, Natasha, and Florence pose once again for photos, their glasses raised in celebration. The photographer captured the moment, another image for the Blackwood family album from which I would be conspicuously absent. The reception continued with mechanical perfection, each moment choreographed to project the image Florence had spent months crafting. I found myself at a table with distant Blackwood relatives who asked polite questions about my work before quickly turning to gossip about people I didn't know. My isolation was by design. Florence's seating chart had strategically placed me away from anyone with actual influence. I was finishing my second glass of wine when Florence approached, her smile tight as she leaned down to speak in a hushed tone. "Kara, darling, would you mind helping the catering staff check on the dessert display? They seem to be falling behind, and I know how detail-oriented you are with these things." Another thinly veiled dismissal, another task deemed suitable for the outsider. Before I could respond, she continued. "Oh, and the photographer wants a few more family portraits before we lose the perfect sunset lighting. Curtis is waiting with everyone by the rose garden." I watched as she glided away, not waiting for my response, secure in her assumption that I would comply. From across the room, Natasha's mother observed the interaction, her expression curious. "I'll be there shortly," I called after Florence, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Her step faltered momentarily before she continued toward the French doors leading to the garden. I drained my wine and followed, not toward the kitchen as instructed, but toward the rose garden where the Blackwood family was assembling. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the meticulously maintained grounds, painting the scene in warm hues that the photographer was enthusiastically describing as absolutely perfect light. Florence stood center stage, arranging Toby and Natasha while instructing Curtis on where to stand. "There you are," she said when she spotted me approaching. "Did you speak with the catering staff?" "I thought I'd join the family photos first," I replied, stepping toward Curtis. Florence's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. "Oh, we don't want to delay the kitchen. Besides, these are just the immediate family shots to complement the ones from earlier." "I am immediate family," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "I'm Curtis's wife." A heavy silence fell over the group. Curtis shifted uncomfortably, looking between his mother and me with the expression of someone who wished to be anywhere else. Toby stared at his shoes while Natasha pretended to adjust her veil. "Of course you are, dear," Florence replied, her tone one would use with a difficult child. "But for these particular photos, we're looking for the Blackwood lineage specifically, for the family history records." "The Blackwood lineage," I repeated, feeling Curtis tense beside me. Fascinating how that lineage now includes Natasha after just a few hours of marriage, yet somehow excludes me after 3 years. Florence's facade cracked slightly, irritation bleeding through her polished exterior. "Kara, please don't make a scene. Not today. Is that what I'm doing? Making a scene by expecting to be treated as part of this family?" "Mother," Curtis finally spoke, his voice strained. "Perhaps we could take a few with Kara as well." Florence's expression shifted to one of wounded disappointment, a look I'd seen her deploy countless times to manipulate her sons. "Curtis, we've already discussed the specific shots needed for the family archive. We can certainly take casual photos with everyone later at the reception." "Casual photos," I echoed, the words bitter on my tongue, "as opposed to the official family record." The photographer, sensing tension, busied himself adjusting his equipment. Natasha's parents had wandered over, curious about the delay. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Reynolds asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Absolutely," Florence assured her with a practiced smile. "We're just finalizing the family groupings. Kara was just leaving to check on the dessert presentation." That was the moment, the precise second when something inside me shattered. Not from the exclusion itself, which was merely the latest in a long pattern, but from the casual certainty with which Florence announced my departure. The absolute confidence that I would retreat, as I always had before, in the name of keeping peace. "No," I said, the word hanging in the air between us. I'm not. Florence's smile faltered. I beg your pardon? I said no, Florence. I'm not leaving. I'm not checking on desserts, I'm not stepping aside, and I'm not pretending anymore that your treatment of me is acceptable. Curtis stepped forward, placing a hand on my arm. Kara, please. I shook him off, my gaze fixed on Florence. 3 years, Florence. 3 years I've endured your subtle dismissals, your backhanded compliments, your systematic efforts to remind everyone that I'm not really a Blackwood. That ends today. This is hardly the time or place, Florence hissed, her composure slipping as guests began to notice the confrontation. On the contrary, I replied, my voice gaining strength. This seems like exactly the right time and place, surrounded by everyone you've been so desperate to impress with this extravagant display. The photographer had lowered his camera, clearly unsure whether to continue. Natasha's parents looked between Florence and me with undisguised interest, while Toby shifted uncomfortably beside his new bride. You've made your point, Florence said through clenched teeth. Now, if you'll excuse us— I'm not finished, I interrupted, my heart pounding but my voice steady. You've made it abundantly clear that I don't meet your standards for a Blackwood. I'm not from the right family, I didn't attend the right schools, and my accomplishments mean nothing because they weren't inherited. That's not fair, Curtis protested weakly. Isn't it? I turned to him, years of suppressed hurt flooding to the surface. When was the last time you defended me against your mother's treatment? When was the last time you chose me over her expectations? His silence was answer enough. I returned my attention to Florence, whose face had flushed with anger and embarrassment. You've created this perfect image of Blackwood prestige, I continued, gesturing to the elaborate wedding setting around us. This illusion of old money and undiminished fortune, you've cultivated it so carefully, ensuring everyone believes the Blackwoods remain as powerful and wealthy as ever. Florence's expression shifted from anger to something closer to fear. She knew what I was capable of revealing, what secrets I had kept out of loyalty to a family that had never truly accepted me. That's enough, Florence snapped, her voice low but trembling with restraint. Curtis, please take your wife inside. She's clearly had too much to drink. Curtis hesitated, caught between his mother's command and the dangerous glint in my eyes. Before he could decide, I stepped back. You're right, Florence. This isn't the time, I conceded, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. I apologize for the interruption. Please continue with your family photos. Relief washed over Curtis's face, while suspicion narrowed Florence's eyes. She knew me well enough to recognize that my retreat was unusual, but not well enough to understand what it signified. I turned and walked away, my head held high as whispers trailed in my wake. I found an empty room in the west wing of the mansion, Edgar's former study, now preserved like a museum exhibit. The space still carried whispers of his presence. Leather-bound books on finance, a half-empty bottle of his favorite scotch, framed photos of younger versions of Toby and Curtis. I poured myself a measure of the aged liquor, savoring its smoky warmth as I considered my next move. The confrontation in the garden had altered something fundamental within me. For 3 years I had suppressed my dignity, surrendered my place, all in the name of peace and out of love for Curtis. But what had that sacrifice earned me? A husband who wouldn't stand beside me, a mother-in-law who treated me as hired help, and a hollowness that had grown with each concession. I moved to Edgar's desk, running my fingers along the smooth mahogany surface. Unlike Florence, Edgar had welcomed me into the family, recognizing in me not just a suitable match for his son, but someone with the financial acumen to understand his predicament. When I discovered the extent of the Blackwood financial troubles, after his death, the mortgaged properties, the leveraged assets, the mounting debt, it was loyalty to his memory that had prompted me to intervene. You don't owe them anything, I whispered to myself, echoing words Henry had spoken months ago when I'd confided in him about the millions I'd quietly funneled into saving the Blackwood estate and reputation. The door opened, and Curtis stepped inside, his face drawn with tension. "There you are! What the hell was that about?" I took another sip of scotch, allowing the silence to stretch between us. "Tell me, Curtis, if your father were alive, would he have allowed your mother to treat me this way?" The question caught him off guard. "That's not fair. Dad's not here. And Mom is struggling in her own way." "That's not what I asked," Curtis sighed, pouring himself a drink. "No, Dad wouldn't have allowed it. He respected you, valued your opinion. He told me more than once how lucky I was. And yet you stand by while your mother systematically excludes me from your family. She's old-fashioned, Kara. She comes from a different generation, a different world. These traditions matter to her. Do they matter more than I do?" His hesitation told me everything. Curtis wasn't a cruel man, just a weak one, too accustomed to the path of least resistance where his mother was concerned. "You embarrassed her in front of everyone," he finally said, deflecting rather than answering. "After she humiliated me." Again. I set down my glass with deliberate care. "Do you know what she said to me last week when we were discussing the wedding arrangements? She said she was relieved the Blackwood name would continue through Toby and Natasha, since we haven't yet provided her with grandchildren, as if my bloodline would taint the precious Blackwood legacy." Curtis winced. "She didn't mean it that way." "Yes, Curtis, she did, and we both know it." I moved to the window, watching the last golden rays of sun disappear behind the ancient oaks that lined the property. "Your mother has made it clear from day one that I'm not good enough for her son, not worthy of the Blackwood name, and you've made it equally clear that you won't challenge her on it. What do you want from me, Kara? She's my mother, and I'm your wife. Or at least, I thought that meant something." The weight of unspoken truths hung between us. Curtis had never known how close his family had come to financial ruin, how his mother had begged me, ironically on her knees in this very study, to save them from bankruptcy and social disgrace. "I need some time to think," I said finally. "Go back to the reception. Your mother will be looking for you. Kara, just go, Curtis, please." After he left, I remained in the study, formulating what I knew must come next. The confrontation in the garden had been impulsive, fueled by years of accumulated hurt. What followed would be anything but. Florence Blackwood had built her world, on appearances, on the illusion of undiminished wealth and status. It was time to shatter that illusion, to reveal the fragile foundation upon which her superiority rested. I opened Edgar's laptop, still kept in the desk drawer, its password unchanged since his death. With a few keystrokes, I accessed the financial records I'd meticulously maintained, documenting every transfer, every loan, every penny I'd provided, to keep the Blackwood name afloat after Edgar's disastrous investments, $3 million. The number stared back at me from the screen, cold and undeniable. Money transferred from my personal accounts to various Blackwood holdings labeled as investments but functionally gifts. Money that had paid for renovations to the estate, settled outstanding debts, and yes, funded Toby and Natasha's extravagant wedding down to the last orchid in the centerpieces. I had never intended to use this information as leverage. It had been a private choice made out of respect for Edgar and love for Curtis. But Florence had pushed me past the point of quiet sacrifice, and Curtis had made his allegiance clear. My phone chimed with a text from Henry. "Everything okay? Quite a scene by the roses." I replied simply, "It will be. Meet me for breakfast." "Tomorrow?" His response came quickly. "The usual place, 8 a.m. I shut down the laptop and took a final look around the study. On the bookshelf stood a photo of Curtis and me on our wedding day, the one Edgar had insisted on displaying despite Florence's objections. In it, we looked impossibly young and happy, unaware of the fault lines that would eventually fracture. Our marriage. With quiet determination, I rejoined the reception, moving through the crowd with practiced ease. I accepted condolences from a few guests who had witnessed the scene in the garden, deflected concerned questions from others, and maintained the polite facade that had become second nature in Blackwood circles. Florence watched me warily from across the room, no doubt surprised by my composed return. She couldn't know that her victory was temporary, that her dismissal of me had finally broken the last thread of loyalty binding me to her secrets. As I raised my glass during Toby's best man's toast, I caught Florence's eye and smiled. Not the placating smile she was accustomed to, but something new and dangerous. For just a moment, unease flickered across her perfect features, a premonition of what was to come. By tomorrow evening, everyone in Florence Blackwood's carefully curated social circle would know exactly who had been bankrolling the family's continued prosperity. Everyone would understand that the woman Florence deemed unworthy of family photos was the very reason the Blackwood estate remained in Blackwood hands. The foundation of Florence's world was about to crumble, and I would be there to watch it fall. The Blackwood Bistro occupied a corner of Boston's financial district, its understated elegance a magnet for the city's power brokers. Henry was already seated at our usual table by the window when I arrived the next morning. The Sunday edition of the Boston Herald spread before him. "You look remarkably composed for someone who caused quite a stir at the wedding of the season," he remarked, folding his newspaper as I slid into the seat across from him. "Practice," I replied, accepting the coffee the waiter poured without being asked. Henry and I had been meeting here monthly since Edgar's death, a tradition that had begun as financial damage control and evolved into something like friendship. "Florence is making calls this morning," Henry said, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. "Damage control, telling everyone you were overwhelmed by emotion." I smiled thinly. How considerate of her. "She's worried, not just about appearances, though God knows that's her primary concern. She's worried about what you might say." "She should be." Henry leaned forward, his weathered face serious. "What are you planning, Kara?" I took a sip of coffee, considering my answer carefully. Henry had been Edgar's closest friend, the only person besides myself who knew the full extent of the Blackwood financial crisis. He had been there the day Florence discovered the truth, that Edgar's failed investment in a blockchain startup had wiped out not just their liquid assets, but put them on the brink of losing everything. "Do you remember the day Florence came to my office?" I asked instead of answering directly. Henry's expression softened with recollection. 3 weeks after Edgar's funeral, she was wearing black, but her pearls were still perfect. She sat across from me, just like you are now, and told me that under no circumstances could Curtis ever know about his father's financial mistakes. It would destroy him, she said, to learn that the Blackwood fortune was gone. As if the money mattered more than the man who'd built it. "Florence has always valued appearance over substance," Henry agreed. "It's how she was raised." She asked me to help them, not because I was family, but because I had the means and the expertise. The memory still stung, Florence's carefully calculated approach making it clear that my value lay in my bank account, not my place in the family. She promised that if I helped stabilize the family finances, she would accept me fully as a Blackwood. Henry's eyebrow rose. A promise she never intended to keep. No. I set down my cup with deliberate care. Because in her mind, money can be acquired, but breeding cannot. I could provide financial salvation, but I would always be the girl from South Boston whose father built a shipping company with his own hands rather than inheriting it. The waiter returned, taking our breakfast orders with practiced efficiency. When he departed, Henry studied me with the shrewd gaze that had made him a formidable business partner to Edgar. "I warned Edgar about Florence, you know," he said suddenly. "When they were engaged, I told him she wanted the Blackwood name more than she wanted him." "What did he say?" He laughed. "Said he knew exactly what he was getting. a beautiful woman who understood the social requirements of his position. He thought it was a fair exchange. Henry sighed. Edgar wasn't romantic, but he was practical. The problems came later when Toby and Curtis were born. Florence became obsessed with their position, their legacy. She pushed Edgar to take bigger risks to expand the fortune, to ensure the Blackwood name would remain synonymous with power. And he did it to please her, I finished. The parallels with Curtis weren't lost on me. Edgar loved his sons. Henry continued. He wanted them to have everything, the advantages of wealth without its burdens. He didn't realize until it was too late that Florence was raising them to value status above everything else. Our food arrived, but neither of us had much appetite. I pushed eggs around my plate, remembering my own introduction to the Blackwood dynasty 4 years earlier. Curtis and I had met at a fundraiser for the Boston Symphony, where I was representing my father's company as a corporate sponsor. He'd been charming, unpretentious, nothing like the entitled heir I'd expected. Our courtship had been a whirlwind, Curtis seemingly as enchanted by my directness as I was by his worldliness. The first indication that Florence might be an obstacle came at our engagement dinner, when she'd examined my ring with a tight smile and remarked that it was refreshingly modest. Edgar had intervened then, praising Curtis for choosing a partner with substance over flash, a compliment that had simultaneously defended me and established the battle lines. The wedding had been a negotiation of competing visions. Florence pushing for an extravagant society affair, me preferring something more intimate. Edgar had brokered a compromise, but Florence's disapproval had been evident in every detail she managed to control, from the seating arrangement that separated my family from hers to the wedding announcement that mentioned my father's business, in the vaguest possible terms. After the wedding, Florence's campaign had become more subtle but no less persistent. Invitations to family events would arrive at the last minute, making it difficult for me to attend. Conversations would pivot to shared history from which I was excluded. Photos would be arranged as they had been yesterday, with me conveniently absent from the frame. "What did Curtis say when you returned to the reception?" Henry asked, interrupting my memories. "Nothing of consequence." I set down my fork. He avoided me for the rest of the evening, then came home late claiming he needed to help Toby with wedding night jitters. Henry's expression was sympathetic. "And this morning?" "He was gone before I woke up. Left a note saying he was meeting his mother for brunch to smooth things over." The hurt was still fresh, Curtis's choice once again crystal clear. "I've provided $3 million to save the Blackwood family from ruin, and I'm still the outsider who needs to be managed rather than included. So what now?" Henry asked. "What are you planning to do with all this history? All these slights and betrayals?" I met his gaze steadily. "I'm going to tell the truth, Henry. The whole truth. About the Blackwood finances, about who's been quietly funding their lifestyle, about who really paid for yesterday's extravagant display. You realize what that will do to them? To their standing in Boston society? To Curtis?" "Yes," I replied simply. "I do." Henry considered me for a long moment, then reached into his suit jacket and withdrew a slim envelope. "Then you might want this." Inside was a formal invitation to the post-wedding brunch Florence was hosting that afternoon at the Blackwood Country Club, a final showcase of the family's supposed prosperity before the newlyweds departed for their honeymoon. "She didn't send me one," I said unsurprised. "No, but as a longtime family friend and Edgar's former business partner, I received a +1. Henry's eyes twinkled with mischief despite the seriousness of our conversation. "Florence was quite clear that Curtis would be attending alone, as you were indisposed after yesterday's scene. The perfect opportunity. A gathering of Boston's elite, the Reynolds family, and the Blackwood inner circle, all in one place, all still basking in the glow of the wedding's apparent success." "What time does it start?" I asked, slipping the invitation into my purse. 2 o'clock, which gives us— He checked his watch. 4 hours to prepare. Us? Henry's smile was grim. Edgar was my best friend for 40 years. I promised him, on his deathbed, that I'd look out for his family. I think he'd agree that sometimes looking out for someone means forcing them to face the truth, however uncomfortable it might be. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand, grateful for this unexpected alliance. Thank you, Henry. Don't thank me yet, he warned. What you're planning won't just expose Florence, it will change everything, including your marriage. Are you prepared for that? I thought of Curtis, of the man I'd fallen in love with and the man he'd become under his mother's influence. I thought of the years I'd spent trying to earn my place in a family that would never truly accept me. I thought of the dignity I'd surrendered, the humiliation I'd endured, all for the sake of keeping peace. Yes, I said finally. I'm ready. The Blackwood Country Club gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its Georgian columns and manicured lawns a testament to old Boston money. Valets in crisp uniforms received luxury cars at the circular drive, while uniformed staff discreetly guided guests toward the terrace where champagne flowed freely. The post-wedding brunch was Florence's final act in the 3-day spectacle she had orchestrated, a carefully choreographed display of wealth and influence. Henry and I arrived precisely at 2:30, late enough to ensure most guests had assembled but not so late as to miss the formal toasts. I had chosen my outfit with surgical precision, a cream Chanel suit I'd worn to my first board meeting at Meridian Ventures, pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, and the diamond bracelet Edgar had given me on my first Christmas. As a Blackwood. Ready? Henry asked as we approached the entrance. I nodded, my heart steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to do. This wasn't a rash decision, not an emotional response to yesterday's humiliation, but the culmination of years of calculated patience. Florence spotted us the moment we stepped onto the terrace, her champagne flute pausing halfway to her lips as her eyes narrowed in disbelief. Beside her, Curtis paled visibly, his gaze darting between his mother and me as if witnessing an impending collision he was powerless to prevent. Henry! Florence recovered quickly, gliding toward us with practiced grace. I wasn't expecting— Her eyes flickered to me. Both of you. I hope you don't mind, Henry replied smoothly. Kara and I had some business to discuss, and I thought, why not kill 2 birds with 1 stone? Florence's smile remained fixed, though her eyes hardened. How efficient. Curtis mentioned you weren't feeling well after yesterday's excitement. I'm feeling much better now, I assured her. Clear-headed, in fact. Something in my tone must have alerted her to danger, because Florence's smile faltered momentarily before she regained her composure. Well, we're delighted you could join us. Curtis, darling, look who's here. Curtis approached, tension evident, in every line of his body. Kara, I thought we agreed you'd rest today. Did we? I tilted my head. I don't recall agreeing to anything, actually. Before he could respond, Natasha's father called for everyone's attention, raising his glass for a toast to the newlyweds who stood beaming near the stone balustrade overlooking the golf course. Toby, handsome in a navy blazer, had his arm around Natasha, whose white sundress complemented her post-wedding glow. To my beautiful daughter and her wonderful new husband, Mr. Reynolds proclaimed, and to our new extended family, the Blackwoods, who have welcomed Natasha with such warmth and generosity. This weekend has been nothing short of magnificent, a testament to the grace and tradition of these 2 great families joining together. Applause rippled through the crowd as glasses were raised. I sipped my champagne slowly, noting how Florence basked in the approval, her posture straightening with pride. And a special thank you to Florence, Mr. Reynolds continued, for orchestrating such a spectacular celebration. The flowers, the music, the venue, every detail was absolute perfection. Florence inclined her head modestly, though the satisfaction in her eyes was unmistakable. The Blackwood family has always believed in honoring tradition, she replied. Nothing but the best for our Toby and his bride. It was the opening I'd been waiting for. Speaking of the best, I said, my voice carrying across the sudden lull in conversation, I'd like to propose a toast as well. Florence's smile froze as every head turned toward me. Curtis took a half step forward as if to intervene, then stopped, perhaps realizing the scene that would cause. I raised my glass. To Florence Blackwood, who understands better than anyone the importance of appearance, who knows that perception is reality in certain circles. I paused, meeting her increasingly, wary gaze, and who has managed to maintain the illusion of Blackwood prosperity with remarkable determination. A confused murmur rippled through the gathering. Florence's knuckles whitened around her champagne flute. Kara, Curtis warned quietly. I continued, as if I hadn't heard him. The truth is, none of this would have been possible without significant financial support. I gestured to encompass the elegant setting, the lavish food, the expensive champagne. The wedding, this brunch, even the maintenance of the Blackwood estate itself. All of it funded not by the legendary Blackwood fortune, which sadly no longer exists, but by the very person Florence deemed unworthy of appearing in family photographs. The silence that followed was absolute. Florence's face drained of color as the implications of my words sank in. Beside her, Allison Parker's mouth formed. A perfect O of shock. What are you talking about? Natasha's father demanded, looking between Florence and me with growing concern. Henry stepped forward, his presence lending authority to my claims. What Kara is saying, Mr. Reynolds, is that the Blackwood family has been financially insolvent since Edgar's death 2 years ago. The only reason they've maintained their lifestyle, their social standing, and yes, the ability to host your daughter's wedding, is because Kara has been quietly funding them with her own money. The dam had broken. Now it was time for the flood. That's absurd, Florence sputtered, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle even to her own ears. Henry, really, what a ridiculous joke! But Henry wasn't smiling. Neither was I, and the silence that stretched across the terrace was growing heavier by the second. It's not a joke, Florence, I said quietly, reaching into my clutch to withdraw a slim folder. I have the financial records right here. Every transfer, every loan, every penny. I've provided over the past 2 years to maintain the illusion that the Blackwoods remain financially solvent. Curtis stepped forward, his face ashen. Kara, this isn't the place. Actually, it's the perfect place, I countered. Surrounded by all the people Florence has been desperate to impress with money she doesn't have. With a wedding, she didn't. Pay for. Mrs. Reynolds placed a protective hand on her daughter's arm. Is this true? We were under the impression that our families were contributing equally to the wedding expenses. Equally? I couldn't help but laugh. The Reynolds family contributed $200,000 toward this wedding. A generous sum, certainly. But the total cost? Just over $800,000. And the remaining $600,000? That came from me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Florence's eyes darted around the terrace, calculating how to salvage the situation. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, she began, her voice strained. But this is a private family matter that we can discuss at home. That's the problem, Florence. I'm not family. You've made that abundantly clear. So let's discuss it right here in front of all your esteemed guests. I opened the folder and withdrew a document. This is a statement from Meridian Financial, showing the transfer of funds from my personal account to the wedding vendor accounts. You'll notice Florence insisted that all payments be processed through her event planner to maintain the appearance that the Blackwoods were footing the bill. Mr. Reynolds, a businessman first and foremost, stepped forward to examine the document. His expression hardened as he scanned the figures. And it's not just the wedding, I continued, ruthlessly exposing 2 years of deception. The mortgage, on the Blackwood estate was in foreclosure after Edgar's death. The taxes hadn't been paid in over a year. The family investment portfolio had been liquidated months before to cover crushing debt from a failed venture. Toby, looking stricken, turned to his mother. "Mom, is this true?" Florence's composure was crumbling. The carefully cultivated image of Blackwood prosperity, the foundation of her social standing, her self-worth, was disintegrating before her eyes. "Your father made some unfortunate investments," she admitted finally, her voice barely audible. "But Kara offered to help. She insisted—" "Insisted?" Henry interrupted, his tone incredulous. "Florence, you came to her office. You begged for her assistance. After you swore me to secrecy," I added. "After you made me promise never to tell Curtis or Toby the truth about their father's financial mistakes. After you promised that if I helped, you would finally accept me as part of the family." Curtis stared at his mother, comprehension dawning in his eyes. "You knew. All this time, you knew we were broke, and you let Kara bail us out while continuing to treat her like she didn't belong?" Florence's face contorted with a mixture of shame and defiance. "I was protecting you. Protecting the Blackwood name. What would people say if they knew Edgar had lost everything? So instead you borrowed millions from me without Curtis's knowledge," I said. "You maintained this elaborate charade of Blackwood wealth while systematically excluding the very person funding it all." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Murmurs spread through the gathered guests, eyes darting between Florence, Curtis, and me with a mixture of shock and fascination. Boston's elite loved nothing more than the fall of one of their own. Natasha, her wedding glow fading rapidly, looked between her new husband and her in-laws with growing horror. "Toby, did you know about this?" "Of course he didn't," I answered for him. Florence was determined that no one would know, especially not her sons. She believed it would destroy their confidence, tarnish their birthright. I met Florence's gaze directly. She couldn't bear for them to know that their prestigious Blackwood name was worth less than the paper it was printed on. Allison Parker, Florence's closest ally in the social hierarchy, had already begun edging away, distancing herself from the rapidly unfolding scandal. Others were doing the same, whispering behind hands and discreetly checking their watches. "This is unconscionable," Mr. Reynolds declared, his face flushed with anger. "We joined our daughter to your family under false pretenses. Had we known the Blackwoods were financially dependent on a daughter-in-law you apparently don't even respect enough to include in family photographs." "Dad, please," Natasha interjected, clearly mortified. "No, Natasha. This goes beyond embarrassment. This is fraud." He turned to Florence, years of business negotiations giving steel to his voice. "You deliberately misrepresented your financial situation to our family." Florence's hands trembled as she set down her champagne flute. "Michael, please, the children shouldn't suffer for my—" "For your what, Florence?" I asked quietly. "Your pride? Your deception? Your absolute refusal to acknowledge that the precious Blackwood legacy means nothing without the money to maintain it?" Curtis moved to stand beside me, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "All this time you've been supporting us and I had no idea. Because your mother made me promise not to," I replied simply. "She said it would devastate you to learn that your father had lost everything, that it would undermine your confidence in the Blackwood name. And I believed her, because I loved you." The past tense wasn't lost on him. His eyes searched mine, finding not the anger he expected, but something worse. Resignation. The perfect silence that had fallen over the gathering was broken by the sound of Florence's pearl bracelet hitting the terrace's stone floor as she sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The illusion of Blackwood invincibility had finally shattered. The elegant brunch disintegrated with surprising speed. The Reynolds family huddled in fierce conversation, their anger palpable. Society matrons who had once fawned over Florence now whispered behind their hands, eyes gleaming with the excitement of fresh scandal. The catering staff, sensing disaster, began quietly clearing plates while avoiding eye contact with anyone. "I think we should leave," Henry murmured, placing a steadying hand at my elbow. I nodded, suddenly aware of the weight of what I'd done. Not regretful. Florence's humiliation had been earned through years of calculated cruelty, but sobered by the collateral damage. Toby stood shell-shocked beside his new bride, the honeymoon glow replaced by the pallor of someone whose foundations had crumbled. Curtis remained frozen beside me, his gaze fixed on his mother's collapsed figure. "Curtis," I said softly, "we need to talk, but not here." He nodded mechanically. "I'll meet you at home." Henry guided me through the dispersing crowd, nodding farewell, to those brave enough to make eye contact. As we reached the entrance, a hand caught my arm. I turned to find Toby, his familiar features, so like Curtis's but softer somehow, twisted with confusion. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "All of it?" "Yes," I replied simply. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, Toby. Your father wanted to protect you both." "And my wedding? The honeymoon villa in Tuscany? The trust fund mother said was waiting for us?" I hesitated. "The wedding was real, the villa. I arranged it as a gift to you and Natasha. But there is no trust fund, Toby. Not anymore." His face crumpled briefly before he regained control. "Thank you for telling me the truth. Finally." He glanced back at Natasha, who was engaged in intense conversation with her parents. "I should get back." As Henry drove us away from the country club, I watched the elegant white building recede in the side mirror, feeling oddly disconnected from the chaos I'd left behind. "You did what needed to be done," Henry said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between us. "Did I?" The question wasn't rhetorical. "I've just destroyed Curtis's family." "No," Henry's voice was firm. "Florence destroyed her family when she chose pride over honesty. You simply revealed the truth." We returned to Henry's Beacon Hill townhouse, a refuge from the storm that would undoubtedly follow. His housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, took one look at our faces and wordlessly produced a pot of strong tea and a plate of shortbread before discreetly disappearing. "What happens now?" I asked, cradling the delicate china cup between my palms. Henry settled into his leather armchair, looking every bit the successful businessman despite the emotional turmoil of the afternoon. "Florence will attempt damage control. She's remarkably resourceful. She'll find some way to reframe the narrative." "It won't work," I said. "Not this time. Too many people heard the truth." "No, it won't work," he agreed. "The Reynolds family alone will ensure the story spreads through every corner of Boston society. By tomorrow, Florence Blackwood's carefully constructed empire will be in ruins." The thought brought less satisfaction than I'd anticipated. "And Curtis?" Henry's expression softened. "That depends largely on you, my dear, and on him." My phone buzzed with incoming messages. Curtis, asking when I'd be home. Toby, demanding more answers. And surprisingly, Natasha, thanking me for my honesty despite the terrible timing. I set it aside, not ready to engage with any of them yet. "There's something else you should know," Henry said after a moment, reaching for a folder on the side table. "Something Edgar asked me to keep until the time was right." He handed me an envelope bearing the Blackwood family crest, Edgar's personal stationery. Inside was a letter, dated just weeks before his death, addressed to Curtis and Toby. He knew he was dying. Henry explained quietly. The heart attack wasn't unexpected. His doctor had warned him for months that his stress levels were unsustainable. I scanned the letter, tears welling in my eyes at Edgar's elegant handwriting. It was a confession and an apology for the financial mistakes that had decimated the family fortune, for allowing Florence's obsession with status to overshadow their lives, for not having the courage to tell them the truth while he was alive. And there, in the final paragraph, was a message that made my breath catch. To Curtis. In Kara, you have found someone of true value, not the hollow value your mother places in names and lineages, but the substance of character, intelligence, and genuine compassion. She sees you, son, not the Blackwood name or fortune. When you have nothing else, remember that is everything. He wanted them to know, I whispered. Henry nodded. Eventually, yes. But he knew Florence would fight it with everything she had. He asked me to wait, to watch over all of you, and to help when the time came to bring the truth into the light. So, this was always going to happen, I realized. In some form or another, Henry agreed. Florence's illusion was unsustainable. The only question was, how much damage would be done before reality broke through? I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. I need to show this to Curtis. Yes, Henry agreed. But first, he hesitated, then continued, with characteristic directness. You need to decide what you want from him, because after today, nothing between you will be the same. The question caught me off guard. What did I want from Curtis? When I'd married him, I'd wanted a partner, an equal, someone who would stand beside me, not behind his mother. Today had exposed not just Florence's deception, but Curtis's weakness, his willingness to sacrifice my dignity rather than challenge his mother's authority. I don't know, I admitted finally. Part of me wants to walk away, to leave them all, to deal with the consequences of Florence's pride. And the other part? I thought of Curtis, not as he'd been today or yesterday, but as he was when we first met. His genuine laugh, his passion for environmental law, his tentative steps toward independence from his family's expectations. That Curtis had been worth fighting for. Was he still there, beneath the layers of his mother's influence? The other part remembers why I fell in love with him, I said softly, and wonders if, freed from his mother's manipulation, he might become that person again. Henry nodded thoughtfully. Then perhaps today's revelations, painful as they are, offer an opportunity for both of you. My phone buzzed again. Curtis, asking where I was, his concern evident even in text. I gathered my clutch and stood. I should go, I said. Florence may have lost her power, but there's still much to resolve. Henry walked me to the door. Remember, Kara, you've done nothing wrong. Florence asked for your help, then punished you for providing it. Whatever happens next, don't carry her shame as your own. The townhouse Curtis and I shared in Back Bay was silent when I arrived. No lights burned in the windows, no sign of Curtis's car in our designated parking space. I wasn't surprised. He was likely still dealing with the aftermath at the country club, attempting to salvage what remained of the Blackwood reputation. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled in the living room, Edgar's letter on the coffee table before me. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across our carefully curated furnishings. Furnishings I had paid for, though Curtis believed they came from what remained of his trust fund. So many lies, so many careful omissions, and half-truths, all designed to protect the fragile male ego and the precious Blackwood name. My phone chimed with a text from Henry. Florence left the club with Allison. Curtis searching for you. Toby and Natasha's flight to Italy canceled. The dominoes were falling exactly as expected. Florence would be strategizing with her closest ally. Curtis would be caught between concern for me and loyalty to his mother. And the newlyweds' plans were collapsing alongside the family facade. I hadn't specifically planned for this day, hadn't engineered Florence's exclusion of me from the wedding photos or her dismissive treatment throughout the weekend. But I had prepared for the moment when my patience finally ran out, when the accumulated slights and dismissals reached critical mass. The financial documentation in my clutch was no spontaneous collection. It had been meticulously prepared months, ago, updated regularly, and stored securely for the day when Florence's treatment of me finally crossed the line from bearable to unacceptable. The sound of a key in the lock announced Curtis's arrival. He entered slowly, his suit jacket draped over one arm, his tie loosened, looking every bit as exhausted as I felt. "You're here," he said simply, dropping his keys on the entryway table. As promised. He crossed to the bar cart and poured himself a generous measure of scotch, downing half before turning to face me. "You've destroyed her, you know." "She destroyed herself, Curtis. I merely exposed what she's been hiding. In front of everyone who matters to her. To us." There was accusation in his voice, but uncertainty too. "Did you plan this from the beginning? Was it all some elaborate scheme? To what end? Humiliating your mother?" "Believe me, Curtis, if that had been my goal, I could have achieved it long before now." I gestured to the space between us. "This was never about revenge. It was about dignity. About finally being acknowledged as your wife, not just your mother's convenient financial safety net." He sank onto the sofa across from me, the fight draining from him. "Why didn't you tell me? About the money, about all of it?" "Because your mother made me promise not to. Because she convinced me that learning about your father's financial failures would devastate you." I studied his face, searching for the man I'd married beneath the shell of Florence's making. "And because part of me hoped that eventually you would see me, really see me, without needing to know what I'd done for your family." Curtis stared into his glass, the amber liquid catching the fading light. "Dad really lost everything?" "Not everything," I corrected gently. "He lost money, Curtis, assets, things that can be replaced. But he never lost his integrity, his kindness, or his love for you and Toby." I reached for Edgar's letter. "Henry gave me this today. Your father wrote it before he died. I think you should read it." His hand trembled slightly as he took the envelope, recognizing his father's handwriting. Immediately, as he read, the color drained from his face, then returned in a flush of emotion. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. "He knew," Curtis whispered. "He knew what would happen to us without him there to balance her need for status." "He knew," I agreed. "And he trusted that eventually the truth would come out, that you and Toby would be strong enough to face it." Curtis set the letter carefully on the table between us. "I've been a coward." "No," I disagreed. "You've been a son who loved his mother and wanted her approval. There's no shame in that. But there is shame in standing by while she systematically excluded my wife from our family, while she took your money with one hand and pushed you away with the other." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, head bowed. "I knew something was wrong, sensed it, but I didn't want to see it. It was easier to let you handle Mother, to avoid the conflict." "Yes," I said simply. There was no point denying what we both knew to be true. "What happens now?" he asked, echoing my earlier question to Henry. "That depends on what you want, Curtis." "And what I want?" He looked up sharply. "Are you leaving me?" The question hung between us, loaded with fear and possibility. Was I? The revenge I'd enacted against Florence had been satisfying in the moment, but it hadn't erased the years of hurt or Curtis's failure to stand beside me. Yet Edgar's letter reminded me of what I'd once seen in Curtis, potential separate from his family name, goodness distinct from his mother's values. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "I love the man I married, the man who saw me for himself, who valued my mind and my heart above my family connections or lack thereof. But that man has been increasingly absent these past 2 years, replaced by someone who watches silently while his mother undermines and excludes his wife." Curtis winced but didn't deny it. "I want to be that man again," he said quietly. "The one who deserved you. Then you need to decide who you are without your mother's influence, without the Blackwood name and fortune to define you. I rose, gathering my purse. And I need some time to decide if what's left is enough for me. Where are you going? Panic edged his voice. To my apartment downtown. Another secret I'd kept. The small but elegant pied-à-terre I'd maintained in my own name. A financial precaution that now served as emotional insurance as well. I need space to think, Curtis. And you need time to deal with your family. When will you come back? I paused at the door, the weight of the day settling on my shoulders. I don't know, but I'll call you tomorrow. There are practical matters we need to discuss. The estate mortgage, Toby and Natasha's situation, your mother's living arrangements. Kara, he called as I reached for the doorknob. I'm sorry, for all of it. I turned back, meeting his gaze directly. I know. But right now, that's not enough. As I stepped into the cool evening air, my phone chimed with a text from Henry. Florence requesting meeting tomorrow. Says she has proposition for you. Of course she did. Florence Blackwood wouldn't surrender her carefully constructed world without a fight. What she didn't realize was that the battle was already over, not just because her social standing was in tatters, but because I no longer cared about earning her approval or acceptance. For the first time in 3 years, I was free of the Blackwood shadow. Whether Curtis would step into that freedom alongside me remained to be seen. Florence chose the Bristol Lounge at the Four Seasons for our meeting. Neutral territory with sufficient privacy for sensitive conversations, yet public enough to discourage scene-making. When I arrived precisely at noon, she was already seated at a corner table, her posture rigid, her appearance immaculate despite the chaos of the previous 24 hours. Kara? She acknowledged stiffly as I took the seat across from her. Thank you for coming. You said you had a proposition, I replied, declining the social niceties that would normally precede such a conversation. Those privileges had been forfeited long ago. A waiter appeared at my elbow. Florence had already ordered tea, its delicate aroma wafting between us. I requested black coffee, strong and unadorned. I've spent the night considering our situation, Florence began once the waiter departed. Her voice was controlled, betraying nothing of the humiliation she must have endured. What happened? Yesterday was unfortunate. Unfortunate? I repeated, eyebrows raised. That's an interesting characterization of your years of deception. Her lips tightened briefly. We both made choices, Kara. I chose to protect my sons from knowledge that would have devastated them. You chose to help, then to weaponize that help when it suited you. Is that how you see it? That I weaponized my assistance? I leaned forward slightly. Florence, you begged me to save your family from financial ruin. I agreed, asking nothing in return except to be treated with basic respect and dignity as your son's wife, a condition you consistently failed to meet. A flicker of something, not quite shame, perhaps recognition, crossed her features before she marshaled them back to careful neutrality. We have different perspectives on the past. I'm more concerned with the future. And what future do you envision, Florence? One where your social standing remains intact? Where the Blackwood name continues to command respect despite having nothing behind it but air? She set down her teacup with precision. I'm proposing a compromise that benefits us all. The damage is done. My sons know the truth about our finances. The Reynolds family is justifiably upset, and certain social circles will need careful management in the coming months. And how does this concern me? You control the purse strings, Kara. Whether we like it or not, the Blackwood estate, the family investments, even Toby and Natasha's future, they all depend on your continued financial support. I couldn't help but laugh. So after publicly humiliating me, excluding me from family events, and treating me as an afterthought for 3 years, you're now asking me to continue funding the Blackwood lifestyle. I'm offering a genuine partnership, Florence countered. Full acknowledgement of your contributions, both financial and otherwise. A seat at the table, so to speak. At the table? I echoed. You mean the family table you've repeatedly denied? Me access to? The one where you ensured I wasn't photographed? That table? Florence's composure slipped slightly, frustration bleeding through her careful mask. I made mistakes. I allowed my concerns about Curtis's choice to cloud my judgment. My background, you mean? My lack of pedigree? Your unconventional upbringing, she amended carefully. My father built a shipping company from nothing, Florence. He valued hard work, integrity, and genuineness, qualities the Blackwood name traded on long after the actual virtues disappeared. I sipped my coffee, letting the bitterness fortify me. You never gave me a chance because I represented everything you feared. Success without lineage, wealth without heritage. Florence studied me, her calculating gaze measuring my resolve. Perhaps I misjudged you. No, you judged me accurately. You just failed to recognize that your judgment said more about you than about me. I set down my cup. What exactly are you proposing, Florence? In specific terms. She straightened, shifting into the negotiation stance I'd observed at countless charity functions when she was securing donations. A fresh start, public acknowledgement of your role in the family finances, your name added to the estate deed, board positions on the family foundations, and my personal commitment to ensure you're treated as a full member of the Blackwood family. And in return, discretion regarding the extent of our financial difficulties, a unified public narrative that presents the situation as a temporary cash flow issue rather than complete insolvency, and, she hesitated, continued financial support while we rebuild. There it was, the core of Florence Blackwood's proposition. She was offering the acceptance I'd once craved in exchange for preserving what remained of the Blackwood facade, and continued access to my money. 2 days ago, I might have considered it. The acknowledgement, the seat at the table, the public validation, these had been the things I'd wanted since marrying Curtis. But Florence's offer came too late, tainted, by necessity rather than genuine respect. You still don't understand, I said quietly. This was never about being accepted into the Blackwood family on your terms. It was about being respected as Curtis's wife, as a person of value regardless of my background. And you will be, Florence insisted. The circumstances have changed. Yes, they have, because now everyone knows the truth, that the illustrious Blackwood fortune is gone, that the wedding wasn't paid for by family money, but by the very person you've systematically excluded. I gathered my purse, prepared to leave. You're not offering me respect, Florence. You're offering me a transaction, my money for your grudging acknowledgement. I declined that arrangement 3 years ago when I started helping your family, and I decline it now. Florence's facade cracked, real emotion bleeding through for perhaps the first time in our relationship. What do you want from me, Kara? An apology? Fine, I apologize. But think of Curtis, of Toby. Think of what this means for them if you walk away completely. I paused, considering her words. She had finally hit upon the one argument that could reach me, the welfare of the brothers whose lives would be irrevocably altered by my decisions. I have no intention of abandoning Curtis or Toby, I said finally. But my support will come with new conditions, ones that have nothing to do with you or your approval. Florence's relief was palpable, though she tried to disguise it. Name your terms. I'm not discussing them with you, I replied, rising from my seat. My relationship with Curtis is between him and me. My financial support for Toby and Natasha is between them and me. You are no longer the gatekeeper of the Blackwood family, Florence. That role, like your social standing, was built on an illusion that no longer exists. As I walked away, leaving her stunned at the table, I felt the final pieces of my plan click into place. Florence had come seeking a compromise, but had inadvertently handed me something far more valuable: confirmation that the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The trap had been set long ago, baited with my money and Florence's pride. Now it had snapped shut, liberating not just me, but potentially Curtis and Toby as well, from the weight of expectations that had burdened the Blackwood name for generations. My phone was ringing before I reached the hotel lobby. "Curtis," I heard. "You met with my mother," he said without preamble when I answered. "News travels fast," I replied, stepping outside into the crisp autumn air. "She called me. She's upset." I declined her offer to buy my way into the family's good graces, I said evenly. I imagine that was upsetting for her. A pause. "Can we meet? There are things we need to discuss that shouldn't be handled over the phone." I agreed to meet him at my downtown apartment, a space he'd never visited despite its existence throughout our marriage. Another boundary I'd maintained, another secret kept, not out of deception but self-preservation. The apartment was a reflection of the person I'd been before meeting Curtis. Modern, minimalist, unapologetically my own taste rather than the traditional aesthetic the Blackwoods preferred. I'd purchased it with my first major investment return, a tangible symbol of independence that had proven more prescient than I'd realized at the time. Curtis arrived 30 minutes later, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. His hair was uncombed, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. "Nice place," he commented, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. "How long have you had it?" 5 years. Since before we met." He nodded, slowly, processing this new piece of information about the woman he'd married yet never fully known. "You never mentioned it. You never asked about my life before you, Curtis." "Not really." I gestured to the sofa. "Please sit. Would you like something to drink?" "No, thank you." He remained standing, hands in pockets, uncertainty written across his features. "I spoke with Toby this morning. He and Natasha are postponing their honeymoon. The Reynolds family is reconsidering certain joint business ventures in light of recent revelations." "That's understandable." "Kara, what did you say to my mother?" She was nearly incoherent when she called. I related the conversation faithfully, watching Curtis's expression shift from concern to understanding as Florence's proposition became clear. "She still doesn't get it," he said finally, running a hand through his hair. "Even now, she sees this as a transaction to be negotiated, a problem to be managed." "That's who she is," I replied gently. "Florence views relationships as exchanges of value, social standing, financial support, family connections. It's how she's navigated her entire life." Curtis moved to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about who I am without my mother's influence, without the Blackwood name." He turned to face me. "I don't know the answer yet, but I want to find out." "And how do you plan to do that?" "I've made a decision." His voice steadied, resolve replacing uncertainty. "I'm stepping away from the family completely, financially, socially, in every way that matters. I've already spoken with my firm about taking on more environmental cases, regardless of client prestige. I've called a realtor about selling my share of the townhouse." I studied him carefully, looking for any trace of manipulation or performance. "And your mother?" "She'll always be my mother, Kara, but I won't allow her to dictate my choices anymore, including how I treat the woman I married." He stepped closer. "I know it might be too late for us. I know I've failed you repeatedly. But whether you decide to stay with me or not, I need to become someone I can respect when I look in the mirror." His words resonated with unexpected sincerity. This wasn't Florence's calculated charm or social maneuvering. This was Curtis stripped bare of pretense, facing consequences perhaps for the first time in his privileged life. "It won't be easy," I warned him. "Your mother won't surrender her influence without a fight." "I know," he said simply, "but I'm ready for that fight now." The following Saturday, Henry hosted a small dinner at his townhouse, a gathering intentionally separate from the Boston social scene where the Blackwood scandal continued to reverberate. Toby and Natasha had accepted his invitation, as had Curtis. I arrived last, uncertain of what to expect from this impromptu family council. Henry's dining room was warm with candlelight, the table set with his late wife's china, but without the fussy formality Florence would have insisted upon. Toby and Natasha were already seated, their faces showing the strain of the past week. Curtis stood by the fireplace, visibly relieved when I appeared in the doorway. "Thank you all for coming," Henry said once we were settled with wine glasses, filled. "I thought it might be helpful to have a conversation away from external pressures." The euphemism for Florence hung in the air, acknowledged by Toby's grimace. "Have you spoken with her?" I asked him gently. "Not since Tuesday," he admitted. "She's staying with Allison Parker, apparently plotting some kind of social comeback." He exchanged glances with Natasha. "We've decided to take a step back from the family dynamics for a while. Michael Reynolds offered Toby a position with their company's West Coast division," Natasha explained. "We're moving to San Francisco next month." The physical distance they were creating spoke volumes about their need to escape Florence's orbit. Geography as a boundary when emotional ones had failed. "A fresh start," Curtis nodded approvingly. "That's brave." "What about you two?" Natasha asked, looking between Curtis and me. "I know things have been complicated, an understatement of magnificent proportions." Curtis and I had spent the past days in careful conversation, negotiating the landscape of our marriage with new honesty. There had been painful revelations on both sides, my resentment at his failure to stand up for me, his shame at his financial dependence, our mutual recognition that the foundation of our relationship had been compromised by secrets and silence. "We're working through it," I said simply. "One day at a time." "Curtis mentioned you've offered to honor the commitments made for our honeymoon and housing," Toby said, his expression serious. "I want you to know we don't expect that, Kara. None of this was your responsibility." "It wasn't about responsibility," I replied. "It was about caring for family, the family I chose when I married Curtis, regardless of whether that choice was reciprocated." Henry raised his glass. "To chosen family," he said, "and to Edgar, who would be proud of how his children are facing adversity with integrity." As we drank to Edgar's memory, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Collins appeared a moment later, her expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Blackwood is here," she announced. "She's quite insistent on joining the gathering." The room froze. Henry looked to me, then to Curtis and Toby, silently questioning how to proceed. "Show her in," Curtis said finally. "It's time we all spoke directly." Florence swept into the dining room like a diminished queen, her designer outfit impeccable, but her eyes betraying her uncertainty. She faltered momentarily upon seeing all of us together, clearly not having anticipated a united front. "Mother," Toby acknowledged coolly. "This is unexpected. I was informed of this little gathering," she said, her gaze sliding past me to Henry. "I thought it appropriate that I be included in family discussions." "Appropriate," I repeated, the word hanging between us like a challenge. "Like excluding me from family photographs was appropriate?" Florence's facade cracked, just for a moment, revealing not the calculated social operator, but a woman suddenly confronting the consequences of her choices. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of social humiliation or financial ruin, but the primal fear of losing her children. "I made a mistake," she said, the admission clearly costing her. "Several mistakes." "Yes," Curtis agreed quietly. "You did, and now we're all dealing with the fallout." Florence looked around the table, taking in the unity that had formed in her absence, a family reconfiguring itself without her at its center. In that moment, I could see the realization dawning in her eyes. Her careful manipulations, her social maneuvering, her desperate preservation of appearances had cost her the one thing she truly valued: her son's loyalty. "Please," Henry said, breaking the tense silence. "Join us, Florence." Mrs. Collins brought another place setting, positioning it pointedly at the end of the table, as far from the head as possible. Florence sat stiffly, her hands clasped before her like a shield. "We were just discussing Toby and Natasha's plans," Henry continued smoothly. "They've accepted a position in San Francisco." Florence's composure slipped. "San Francisco? But you've only just been married. Your place is here with family." "The family that lied to me about my financial situation?" Toby countered. "The family that misled my in-laws about our contribution to the wedding?" "I was protecting you," Florence insisted. "Protecting the Blackwood legacy your father worked so hard to build." "The legacy he lost?" Curtis corrected. "The legacy Kara salvaged while you pretended nothing had changed." Florence's gaze darted between her sons, looking for an ally and finding none. "Everything I've done has been for you, boys, to ensure you maintained the standing and respect the Blackwood name deserves." "And at what cost, Mother?" Curtis asked. "Your deception nearly destroyed my marriage. It's alienated Toby from his new family. All because you couldn't face the truth that the Blackwood fortune is gone, and with it, the artificial status it bought." "You don't understand," Florence protested. "In our world, perception is everything. Once people believe you've fallen, they ensure you never rise again." "Maybe that's the problem," I interjected quietly. "That world you're so desperate to remain part of. It's built on illusions. Smoke and mirrors designed to exclude anyone who values substance over appearance." Florence turned to me, her expression hardening. "Easy to say when you were born outside it. You've never understood what it means to carry a legacy, to be judged by centuries of family history rather than your own achievements." "No," I agreed. "I was judged solely by who I am and what I've built, just as Edgar was before he married into the Blackwood name." Henry nodded. "Edgar came from nothing, Florence. You seem to have forgotten that in your determination to maintain appearances." For a moment, genuine confusion crossed Florence's face. "What are you talking about?" "Edgar was a Blackwood through and through." "Edgar was born Edward Keene," Henry said gently. "A middle-class boy from Worcester who changed his name when he moved to Boston to escape his alcoholic father. He built his fortune from scratch, then leveraged it to marry into the declining Blackwood family. Your family needed his money, just as his needed your social connections." The revelation hit Florence like a physical blow. "That's not possible. Howard would have told me." Howard, her father-in-law, the patriarch who had welcomed Edgar into the family decades ago. Howard was many things, but a fool wasn't one of them, Henry continued. He recognized talent and ambition in Edgar, qualities the Blackwood line had been lacking for generations. The marriage was mutually beneficial. Edgar gained the social standing he craved, and the Blackwoods received an infusion of fresh capital and business acumen. Florence looked to Curtis and Toby, as if seeking confirmation that this was some elaborate deception. Their expressions, surprised but accepting, gave her no comfort. "You never knew," Toby realized. "All these years of judging Kara for her background, and you never knew father came from similar circumstances." "This changes nothing," Florence insisted, though her voice had lost its conviction. "The Blackwood name still carries weight in Boston society." "The weight of deception," Curtis said. "Mother, don't you see? This obsession with appearances, with status, it's destroyed us from within. Dad took financial risks he couldn't afford to maintain the lifestyle you expected. You lied to your own sons rather than admit we weren't as wealthy or established as you pretended. And you rejected Kara, the one person who actually saved our family, because she represented a truth you couldn't face." Florence sat very still, her breathing shallow, her world visibly collapsing around her. The careful construction of Blackwood prestige, the foundation of her identity for decades, was crumbling beneath the weight of revelations she couldn't control or deny. "I think," she said finally, her voice barely audible, "I need some time to process this." As she rose to leave, her legs unsteady, I felt an unexpected pang of empathy. Florence Blackwood had built her life around a fiction she believed was truth, defining her worth by a legacy as manufactured as the financial stability she'd pretended to maintain. "Florence," I called softly as she reached the door. She paused, without turning. "The invitation to join this family, the real family, not the fiction, remains open. But it has to be on terms of honesty, not appearances." She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and departed. 2 weeks after the dinner at Henry's, I received a handwritten note requesting my presence at the Blackwood estate. Florence's elegant script offered no explanation, simply a date and time. I debated ignoring it, having said all I needed to say, but curiosity won out. What could Florence possibly want now that her carefully constructed world had collapsed? Curtis offered to accompany me, but this felt like a conversation that needed to happen woman to woman. Some reckonings couldn't be mediated or softened. The estate looked different somehow as I drove up the winding driveway, less imposing, more vulnerable. Gardens that had once been immaculately maintained showed signs of neglect, the autumn leaves unraked, the hedges slightly overgrown. A visible manifestation of Florence's diminished control. She answered the door herself rather than the housekeeper who had always performed this function. Another small but telling change. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping back to admit me. I followed her to the solarium, a space that had once intimidated me with its perfectly preserved antiques and Florence's carefully staged tea service. Today the room felt strangely ordinary, still beautiful but stripped of the mystique that had once made it feel like entering a museum rather than a home. Florence gestured to a chair while she poured tea from a simple service. "No fine china today, just practical stoneware that wouldn't have been allowed at social gatherings." "I've been doing a great deal of thinking," she began, her voice steadier than I'd expected. "About the choices I've made, the priorities I've set." I accepted the tea without comment, waiting for her to continue. "When I married Edgar, I believed I was joining a family with an unbroken lineage of distinguished achievement. Howard, Edgar's father, or so I thought, cultivated that impression with great care." She glanced at the family portraits lining the wall, generations of Blackwoods glaring down with aristocratic disdain. Learning that Edgar himself was an outsider who had taken the name, it forces me to reevaluate everything. "Including your treatment of me," I supplied. "Yes." She met my gaze directly. "I judged you for precisely the qualities that my husband possessed: ambition, resourcefulness, an unwillingness to be constrained by circumstances of birth." A faint, bitter smile crossed her lips. The irony isn't lost on me. "What do you want from me, Florence?" She set down her cup carefully. "Not forgiveness. I don't expect that. Not yet, anyway." She smoothed her skirt, a nervous gesture I'd never seen before. "I wanted to inform you personally that I've moved out of the estate. I've taken a small apartment in Cambridge near the university." This surprised me. Cambridge? That's quite a change from Beacon Hill. An appropriate one. "I've accepted a position with the university's development office, fundraising for scholarship students from underprivileged backgrounds." She almost smiled at my evident shock. "It seems my skills at persuading wealthy donors to part with their money can be redirected toward more meaningful ends." "And the estate?" "It belongs to the family, to you and Curtis, to Toby and Natasha when they visit. I've had the deed transferred accordingly." She hesitated. "My lawyer will provide all the necessary documentation to ensure the property and remaining family holdings are properly transferred to those who have actually maintained them." The gesture was significant, not merely a practical acknowledgement of financial reality, but a symbolic surrender of the position she had guarded so jealously. Why this change of heart, Florence? When we last spoke, you were still fighting to maintain your social position. She was silent for a long moment, staring out at the gardens her family had tended for generations. Edgar's letter, she said, finally. Henry showed it to me. Not just the part addressed to the boys, but a section written to me. Her voice caught slightly. He knew I would resist change, that I would cling to appearances even when they no longer served any purpose. He asked me to remember why he fell in love with me in the first place. And why was that? A genuine smile touched her lips. Sad, but real. Because when we first met, before I became obsessed with the Blackwood legacy, I was the girl who challenged convention, who spoke my mind regardless of social consequences. The quality I punished in you was precisely what Edgar had valued in me. The irony was both painful and perfect. Florence had spent decades suppressing her authentic self to maintain an illusion of aristocratic privilege, only to discover that the man she'd built her identity around had valued her for exactly the opposite reason. It's never too late to become yourself again, I said quietly. 6 months passed, bringing with them a gradual transformation, not just of circumstances, but of relationships. The Blackwood estate, once a monument to pretension and appearance, had become something simpler and more authentic under our stewardship. Curtis and I had moved in, not out of any desire to inhabit a mansion, but because someone needed to care for the place while we decided its ultimate fate. Toby and Natasha were thriving in San Francisco, far enough from Boston's social constraints that they could forge their own identity as a couple. The Reynolds family, initially furious about the financial deception surrounding the wedding, had eventually softened, largely due to Natasha's fierce defense of Toby as a victim rather than perpetrator of his mother's schemes. The young couple visited for Thanksgiving, filling the old house with genuine laughter, perhaps for the first time in its history. The most surprising transformation, however, was Florence herself. True to her word, she had reinvented herself in Cambridge, channeling her formidable social skills toward fundraising for educational access. Her apartment, a modest 2-bedroom overlooking the Charles River, contained only a few carefully chosen pieces from her former life. Edgar's desk, family photographs stripped of their ornate frames, and a simple pearl necklace he had given her on their first anniversary. Our relationship remained complicated. Too much hurt had occurred for easy forgiveness. But there had been gestures on both sides. I had helped her establish connections in the nonprofit world where my name carried weight. She had volunteered at my father's scholarship foundation, working without recognition to expand opportunities for first-generation college students. Curtis had transformed perhaps the most profoundly. Freed from his mother's expectations and the weight of Blackwood pretensions, he had rediscovered his passion for environmental law. He'd left his prestigious firm to start a small practice representing community groups fighting corporate polluters, work that paid far less but fulfilled him in ways his former career never had. "Have you decided what you'll do with the property?" Henry asked one evening as we sat on the terrace, watching the sun set over what remained of the Blackwood holdings. "Actually, yes," Curtis replied, reaching for my hand. "We've been discussing it with Toby and Natasha, and we think we've found the perfect solution." I smiled, still somewhat amazed that Curtis had embraced the idea so enthusiastically. "We're converting the estate into a retreat center for first-generation professionals, a place where people from backgrounds like mine can network, learn to navigate elite spaces, and support each other in fields where they remain underrepresented." Henry's face lit up. "Edgar would have loved that." "We think so too," Curtis agreed, using the very symbol of elite exclusion to dismantle those barriers. There's a poetry to it. "And Florence?" Henry asked delicately. "She's been consulting on the project," I admitted. Her expertise in Boston's social landscape, however problematic its foundations, has been valuable in designing programs that will actually create meaningful access. We sat in companionable silence for a few moments, each lost in thoughts of how dramatically our lives had changed since that fateful wedding weekend. "You know," Henry said finally, "when Edgar asked me to look after his family, I never imagined it would involve such a complete reinvention of what family meant to all of you." "Nor did I agreed. "When I married Curtis, I thought I was joining an established dynasty. Instead, we've created something entirely new." Curtis squeezed my hand. "Something better. Something real." The Blackwood name still appeared on letterhead and legal documents, but it had been transformed from a symbol of exclusive heritage to the banner of a more inclusive vision. The power that had once been wielded to exclude now served to welcome. The privilege that had been hoarded was now being shared. When Florence joined us for dinner that evening, a monthly tradition we had cautiously established, she brought news of her latest fundraising success. As she described the students who would benefit from the scholarships, there was a passion in her voice I'd never heard during her years as Boston's premier socialite. "I've been thinking," she said hesitantly as we finished dessert, "about the family photos." Curtis and I exchanged glances, uncertain where this was heading. "I'd like to take new ones," she continued. "All of us together, for the entrance hall of the retreat center, if you're amenable." The request hung in the air, weighted with history and meaning. This wasn't merely about photographs, but about publicly acknowledging what constituted family, not bloodlines or social status, but chosen bonds of respect and care. "I think that would be appropriate," I said finally. On the morning of the retreat center's official opening, I stood alone in what had once been the Blackwood formal drawing room, now transformed into a bright meeting space where first-generation professionals would soon gather for workshops and networking events. The antique furniture had been replaced with comfortable, modern pieces, the dark wood paneling painted a warm white, the imposing portraits of Blackwood ancestors moved to the family wing where they belonged, as history, not intimidation. Caught a glimpse of myself in one of the few remaining original mirrors, struck by how different I looked from the woman who had stood silently by while excluded from family photographs just over a year ago. The change wasn't merely in appearance but in bearing. I stood straighter, spoke more directly, no longer measuring my words against Florence's potential disapproval. The revenge I'd enacted had brought satisfaction. Yes, the moment Florence realized her social standing had collapsed, when the truth of her financial dependence on me became public knowledge, when her carefully constructed world of appearance and pretense crumbled around her. In those moments, justice had felt pure and clarifying, but the aftermath had proven more complex, more human than the simple narrative of comeuppance I'd imagined. Florence's humiliation hadn't restored the dignity she'd stolen from me. Her fall hadn't elevated me. The victory had been hollow until it transformed into something else entirely. Not revenge, but revolution. Not punishment, but possibility. Deep thoughts? Curtis's voice pulled me from my reflection. He crossed the room to stand beside me, handsome in the simple suit he'd chosen for the opening ceremony. "Just reflecting on how we got here," I replied. "It's not exactly where I imagined we'd end up when I revealed the truth at Toby's wedding brunch." He smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes, something that had become more frequent as he shed the weight of Blackwood expectations. "What did you imagine?" "Honestly, that Florence would be ruined. You would be furious with me for my deception, and I would walk away feeling vindicated if somewhat alone. Instead, you saved us all," Curtis said quietly. "Not just financially, but from the fictions we'd built our lives around." I shook my head. "That's too simple. We saved each other." Through the windows, I could see the caterers setting up on the lawn where we would host the opening reception. Nearby, Florence was directing volunteers with the same precision she had once employed for charity galas, but with a new purpose animating her movements. Do you regret it? Curtis asked. Exposing the truth so publicly? Humiliating my mother the way she humiliated you? The question deserved honesty. Sometimes, I admitted. Not the truth itself, that needed to come out. But perhaps the method. The public spectacle of it. I turned to face him directly. Revenge feels righteous in the moment, but it leaves you hollow afterward. What sustained me isn't Florence's fall, but what we've built from the ruins. Curtis nodded thoughtfully. Dad would say the same thing. He wrote about it in his letter, that mistakes should be learned from, not just punished. The door opened, and Henry entered with Toby and Natasha, who had flown in for the opening. Behind them came Florence, her silver hair styled simply, her clothing elegant but far less ostentatious than in her society days. The photographer is ready when you are, Henry announced. He suggested the grand staircase for the family portrait. Family portrait. The word still carried emotional weight, the echo of exclusion, the memory of standing alone while the Blackwoods posed without me. But now, as we gathered on the staircase, Florence positioned herself at the edge rather than the center, a subtle acknowledgement of the new order. Kara should be in the middle, she said, surprising everyone. This is her vision we're celebrating today. As the photographer arranged us, I found myself in the heart of the group, Curtis's arm around my waist, Toby and Natasha beside us, Henry and Florence flanking the group. The composition wasn't merely physical, but symbolic, a visual representation of the transformation in our relationships. Everyone say, family, the photographer instructed. And we did, the word carrying different meanings for each of us, but linked by a shared understanding that true family had little to do with bloodlines or social standing. Real family was built on acceptance, on honesty, on seeing each other clearly, and choosing to remain connected despite flaws and failures. 2 years after Toby and Natasha's wedding, I stood in the hospital room holding my newborn daughter, marveling at her perfect features and the surprising shock of dark hair that marked her as undeniably mine. Curtis hovered nearby, his expression a mixture of awe and terror that seemed standard for new fathers regardless of background or preparation. She's beautiful, Florence said softly from the doorway, hesitating as if unsure of her welcome despite our carefully rebuilt relationship. Come in, I invited, shifting slightly so she could see her granddaughter more clearly. Meet Edith Grace, Blackwood. Florence's eyes widened at the name. Edith for my grandmother, a self-made woman who had helped my father build his shipping business. Grace for Curtis's great-aunt, the one Blackwood ancestor Florence had described as valuing character over conformity. May I hold her? She asked, her voice uncharacteristically tentative. I placed the baby in her arms, watching as Florence's carefully maintained composure melted away. The woman who had once terrified Boston society with her rigid standards now cooed softly to an infant, completely unconcerned with how undignified it might appear. Hello, little one, she whispered. Welcome to a very unusual family. Unusual. Indeed, transformed by truth, reconstructed on a foundation of authenticity rather than appearance. The Blackwood name remained, but its meaning had changed entirely. Through the window, I could see Henry arriving, carrying an enormous stuffed bear that seemed comically at odds with his usual dignity. Toby and Natasha would arrive tomorrow, flying in from San Francisco, where they were expecting their own child in a few months. The family portrait would soon need updating. When visitors had gone and the hospital room quieted, Curtis joined me on the bed, our daughter sleeping peacefully between us. Happy? He asked, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Beyond happy, I replied truthfully, but also grateful, in an unexpected way. For what? For that moment at Toby's wedding when your mother excluded me from the photos. I smiled at his confused expression. If she hadn't pushed me past my breaking point, we might still be living that fiction. You trapped in a role that didn't fit. Me forever the outsider. Florence manipulating everyone from behind her social facade. Curtis considered this. So her cruelty was actually a gift? Not exactly. But sometimes the worst moments create openings for transformation that comfort never could. I gazed down at our daughter. The pain was real. The exclusion was real. But what came after, this new family we've created, that's real too, and worth everything it took to get here. Outside our window, Boston continued its rhythms. The social season, the charity galas, the careful calibrations of status and connection. But within our circle, a different metric had taken hold. Worth measured by contribution rather than consumption. Belonging based on mutual respect rather than birth or wealth. Family defined by choice rather than circumstance. When the photographer came the following week to capture Edith's first formal portrait, Florence arranged herself beside me without hesitation or direction. The placement was deliberate, significant. Her acknowledgement that the future belonged to new definitions of family, new understandings of legacy. As the camera captured the moment, I realized that the most profound revenge hadn't been Florence's public humiliation or the collapse of her social standing. It had been this, the creation of something genuine from the ruins of pretense, something that welcomed rather than excluded, something that valued substance over appearance. The photograph would hang in the entrance of our home, not as a symbol of status, but as a reminder of transformation, of how the truth, however painful its revelation, had ultimately set us all free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.